Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Foundry Virtual Events program. This is our last Nuke webinar of the year, which is super exciting. We've done about 90 webinars globally since March 30th. So it's a big deal that this is the last Nuke one. We've got one more coming up on Thursday for another product, which I'll talk about later. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm wearing my Christmas jumper in honor of the upcoming holidays, and I hope everyone is looking forward to a break coming soon. Today's session, really excited to have my colleague Chris Weatherly. We were just talking about how it's been a while since we've seen each other in person, and Austin Meyers, who's one of our awesome customers based in, I want to say Montana. Austin, oh my God, I'm going to get your state wrong. Am I right? Good. We're going to walk through some of the training that Austin's just delivered for Foundry, some amazing work, and then we're going to have a great Q&A, so save your new questions for the end. Like I mentioned, we've done a ton of webinars globally this year, all over the world. We have about 42 of them on demand in English. You can find them on our virtual events page on our website. Our 2021 program will kick off again in January 14th, so we're going to take a couple of weeks off. We do have one more on Thursday for any storyboard artists out there for Flix and Storyboard Pro. Otherwise, we'll see you guys back here, guys and gals, back in the new year. Did want to shout out to some of our awesome Foundry Learn content. The training team has been very busy this year, working with customers, developing things in-house. We had an internal competition to create some tutorials, and it's really important to Foundry that we deliver as much learning content for our artists out there as possible. So hopefully if you have some downtime over the holidays and you want to improve your skills a little bit, there's a great chance to do that with some of the content we have. We also have tons of articles that we've been posting. We just released a trends article this morning on our Insights Hub, where our team of writers interview customers, interview industry experts, and create these great stories, sometimes that talk about our products and sometimes that are very industry focused. Take a look, there's some great content out there for you to enjoy. We have some new Nuke family tutorials. I guess that's why we're all here today. We have Austin's new practical compositing course. There's 6.5 hours of content, and Austin's going to give you a preview and a little bit of an overview today. We also just released some Nuke Studio and Hero workflow videos from my colleague Terry Ryasat. So there's some amazing content there as well. Take a look when you have time. And then our great community. This is just one example of Josh Parks, who's based in London, who's doing some amazing work creating content on his own time. So Josh, not only does Josh create training content and masterclasses, but he's also collected an industry overview of all the Nuke training that's out there. So take a look at Josh's website and see what he has to offer. For any students out there, we just want to remind everyone we have a free student license program. If you go to our education website and look for the first year free button, there's some great programs to get you started for Foundry software. For those of you who aren't students, we also offer Nuke non-commercial, and we have our Nuke Indie product as well, based on Nuke Studio that's available. Did want to take a moment to thank all of our fantastic customer presenters this year. I think we were upwards of 50 presenters for 2020, and everyone just jumped in when the pandemic hit, and we were looking to bring content to our artists and users, and it was just amazing to see how many people chipped in. So if you go back to that list of webinars on our website, there's some amazing content that could take you through to the new year if you wanted to do some YouTube watching on some of our webinar content. So with that, I thank you for being here. We thank you for your time, and I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Chris Weatherly.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so welcome everyone. It is fantastic to have you all here. My name is Chris Weatherly. I'm an Associate Product Manager for the Nuke team. Now, typically I'd be out seeing and visiting everyone at trade shows or coming to see clients, but given the state of the world, it is awesome to be able to be here and do this and to have everyone be a part of this new webinar that we're doing. Now, this is actually a really cool one for me to introduce because I recommend some of Austin's old videos all the time, and I think they are really valuable resource for people making that transition from, learning Nuke at university to building up the skills you really need to succeed and thrive in a more production-focused environment. And Austin Meyers, I mean, he'll have his own intro clip. Unfortunately, he's got, a sore throat at the moment, so he'll be here for the Q&A at the end. So you'll see on the top right, there's a questions tab. If you have any questions throughout the entire webinar, put them there and we'll make sure to go through them. I think we'll have about 15, maybe 20 minutes to go through them, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So do use that questions tab. But Austin's someone you'll want to get some answers from, because he's an Emmy and VES award-winning artist. He's been in the industry for ages, and like I said, some of his content that he's done in the past has been invaluable to those that come and join the visual effects industry, and I do recommend them. So with that, I'm going to introduce Austin. Sorry, it's not letting me move on to the next step. I'm going to introduce Austin Meyers, and we'll let him talk for himself. So play the tape.
Welcome to my webinar on practical compositing. My name is Austin Meyers, and I'm a visual effects and compositing supervisor with over 10 years of experience in the visual effects world. I actually started out on the production side of things. I got a film degree from the University of Texas and then wound up getting into commercial production. I was doing some on-set stuff, I was doing some pre-production, and then I actually wound up getting more into turnkey video after that. I would shoot, edit, do motion graphics, even DVD authoring and delivery. That even led me into a little bit of, learning in-depth compression and web design as well. So I started out, more behind the camera than anything else. I actually got into visual effects because I applied to be an editor at a visual effects shop in Louisiana, and they wanted to hire me as a compositor. And I didn't know what a compositor was. I had never heard of the software, and I certainly didn't know how to use it. So I had about a month before my job started, and so I got to go home, tell my girlfriend that I was moving, and then spend a month learning as much as I could about compositing. They were actually a fusion shop, so I did a little bit of, I really tried to learn fusion. I also learned a little bit of Nuke and Shake, while trying to figure out what this node-based thing is and what it's all about. So, I moved and I wound up starting with them, and over 2 years, we built the facility out from, a half a dozen artists to about 80 artists, and I worked my way up to 2D supervisor. Ultimately, I left that shop and wound up going to New York City. I won an Emmy for Boardwalk Empire, as well as a VES award for compositing for that same season of Boardwalk. And, I've worked on every manner of show, lots of high-end TV, lots of low-end TV, feature films, commercials, just really everything in between. And I actually wound up in LA, was running a shop out in LA, and then I got into more, traditional advertising. I actually went to work for an agency where we started up a visual effects group from scratch, and I helped them build that out, and then ultimately I moved into a more of a broader post role, where I was the director of post-production, helping sort of tie all the different pieces of the post process together for that agency. And that leads me to where I am now. I'm actually in Montana currently, and I just do contract jobs, remotely, especially in this COVID world we're in now. For me as a compositor, and ultimately later as a comp soup, finding the order in the chaos that is node-based compositing has always been one of those things at the front of my mind. When I started out, we didn't have the level of documentation or examples or, detailed tutorials where you're, working through every little bit of any particular, problem. We learned from the person we sat next to. That was really how most people learned, and there's still actually a lot of that. And, that's really sort of one of the driving forces for me to create this series. Is I wanted to take my experiences and how I learned, and, a lot of the artists I've trained over the years, I've trained hundreds of artists, and, I wanted to kind of boil that down into a series to sort of traverse start to finish, and show people how to think about compositing in a little bit more of a holistic way. I didn't have that, and this is something that I would have loved to have when I was first starting out. It's Nuke is extremely flexible, and while that's one of its greatest features, it can also be extremely daunting if you're just starting out. There's so many different ways to do things in Nuke, and this series I'm trying to illuminate some different ways to do things, and show sort of best practices of, yes, you can do it 8 different ways, but really you should do it this way or this way. And, show you how to kind of think about it. Ultimately, this series is designed for sort of junior and mid-level artists. I think there's information in this that any artist of any skill level could benefit from. We talk a lot about the big picture stuff, from script organization and asset management, how each of the different processes inside of compositing get integrated into a comp. I think the idea is whenever you're doing, just a single artist task, you should be able to scale that process into something that's a multi-artist shot or a huge multi-artist sequence. It's really all starts from sort of the same kernel. So let's talk a little bit about the course itself. This course is 6.5 hours long. It comes with assets that you can download, and this was all footage that I shot so that we didn't have to worry about any kind of copyright issues or, NDAs, etc. This footage was all shot on a A7 III. It's not the prettiest footage, but that's also kind of the point. Most of our lives in compositing, we're not working with pristine footage. You do have those jobs where everything comes together the way it should, but a lot of what we're doing is, trying to make things work, trying to make what we have work. And like I said, it's a very broad curriculum that we're covering here, from how to load images and export them. And we get into a little bit of the detail. I definitely want to highlight some of the gotchas that I've discovered over the years, or things that I know tend to trip up, new artists or people that are new to Nuke. But we also talk about tracking and painting and roto, and, we get into finishing and sort of how you approach finishing. I also really want to emphasize that these are not meant to be verbatim tutorials. I don't want to tell you to turn this knob this way and this knob that way. The idea really is to teach you how to think about it. I want to show you the approach to compositing. There's always problems we haven't seen before, and so trying to be too micromanaged in what this is, I feel like that doesn't help people sometimes, because you're gonna have an edge case all the time. Sometimes things work straight out of the box, but the idea is to show you how things work here, and then give you that tool set and give you that framework to build upon, so that when you see something you haven't seen before, you know where to start, and you kind of can start to build an approach to it. The other thing I really want to emphasize is, at least the first half of this series, it's meant to build on each subsequent session. So it really is good to start at the beginning and at least watch through the, script organization session, because those all stack. I'm trying to build these themes of organization and efficiency, and ultimately, we'll talk a lot about some of my core tenets of compositing, which is, working explicitly, pre-multiplied, additively, and over. And we really talk a lot about that in those initial chapters. Some of the latter sessions, we're talking about more of the specifics, like tracking and sort of approaches to tracking and roto and paint and, even finishing. And all of those, really relate back to that initial core concepts. So let's go ahead and jump into the individual sessions, I'm going to flip over to my screen and we're going to go through each of these sessions, just a minute or two on each and kind of describe what's in them, what you look to gain from each chapter. Just kind of give you a quick and easy rundown of what this session, what all these sessions are and what this course really boils down to. To access the course, you're going to want to go to foundry.com, and then you'll want to click on the Learn tab up at the top. You'll see a Nuke section, and this lives under the Tutorials button. Once you're in Tutorials, you can actually scroll down, and you'll see the Practical Compositing course. You can then click Show More, and this will show you all 12 sessions. So each of these sessions actually has multiple videos, but I do want to point out first that you want to start with Before You Begin, because that's where the course files live for this entire course. So we have the full course set up as a zip that has footage, that has all the project files and any other ancillary files you might need to follow along with the course. All right, so let's start with Before You Begin. In the Before You Begin session, and you can click Start the Course, and this will give you a playlist of all the different videos in that individual session. So this session is really built to talk about the way you access help files. I also talk about being organized and sort of some general advice on how to come into a project and how to set it up. I also have a little bit more of a granular breakdown of folder structure. This is a folder structure, based on a folder structure that I've used for years and years, and it's modified a little bit, depending on what shop or what project I'm working on. There might be some changes, but this folder structure it's a good starting point, and it's a good way to think about how you build projects. The other emphasis in this too is think about a project in its whole, not just where you start, but try and think about where you're going with that project and all the needs you'll have as you move along the way. All right, next up, let's talk about setup. So setup, this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. And as you can see by the playlist here, we're going to talk about the user interface, how the modules work, how you sort of operate inside of Nuke from a very high level. Again, this is one of those places where the manual is a great resource, and I don't really want to rehash everything that's in the manual, but I do kind of go over some of the quick points that you'll want to be aware of once you start opening Nuke up. Then I have a couple sessions on preferences. These are really a little more nitty-gritty, and they're designed to help you optimize Nuke for your specific hardware and for your personal preferences. Nuke out of the box works pretty well, but with some very simple tweaks, you can really optimize how well Nuke works and squeeze as much performance out of your machine as possible. And I kind of talk about some of the specifics of that in these sessions. Kind of on the same performance trajectory, I talk about frame server and really get into some like nitty-gritty hardware optimization. This is really to grab as much power out of your PC as physically possible. And then lastly, I have a tips and tricks on the basics of path remapping. Path remapping is one of those things that, especially in this sort of, COVID world we live in, you're working on projects in different ways than you used to. We might not be working at a shop. We're working from our home machine, or we're just working in different ways than we used to work. And I actually go over a few of the different ways that you do path remapping and how to work with projects that aren't maybe set up for, local work. All right, next up, let's talk about input and output. We have 8 videos in this session, and really the core of this is talking about how you get images into Nuke and how you get images out of Nuke. Nuke, especially node-based, it operates a little differently than a nonlinear editor or something that's maybe layer-based like After Effects. And this is where we start to really feel that difference. Nuke brings things in differently than some other software. We talk specifically about loading images in, whether that's a MOV file or an image sequence or a different kind of image sequence, and some of the gotchas that come along with that. The next thing we really get into is using generators. Generators are tools inside of Nuke that create an image, where a read node or an image itself is an external file that lives in the file system. There's something tangible there that you are bringing into Nuke. where a generator is something that Nuke holds internally and then is used to create some kind of image. Next up, we talk about frame range and timing. Again, this is really important, especially if you're coming from something that's maybe layer-based or NLE-based. You know, the concept of time in Nuke is a little bit different than these. You know, you can kind of drag things around and change the timing of them, but I get into kind of what those details are about frame range and how you set up timing. Similarly, we talk about retiming and joining clips and kind of that process and, you know, really how to think about it, because again, it is a little different than what you would use in a layer-based approach. Then we get into the write node. We talk about setting up a write node and actually extracting that information that you've spent all the time working on and getting that into a format that other people can use. I then talk a little bit more specifically in how you write out movie files, as well as how you render EXRs and even JPEGs. There are some nuances between different formats, and there's some things that you probably want to be aware of before you start rendering those out. All right, so that's kind of a quick overview of input and output. Next up, we get into merging. The merge is one of the most used nodes in all of Nuke. Rarely are you going to have a comp that doesn't have a merge node, and most of the time you're going to have comps with lots of merge nodes. You know, the merge node is the glue that holds the whole thing together. This is one of those chapters that I think everyone should watch. You know, when I started out, there are differences in the way Nuke merges things together than other applications. You know, the biggest thing is the way it handles transparency. Nuke explicitly handles transparency. Most applications that people deal with, they sort of handle transparency in the alpha implicitly. Like they're assuming an alpha where there might not be one, or they're assuming you want the alpha there, you know, whether you tell it alpha or not. Or you have to explicitly tell it, you know, don't include an alpha, even though that image natively does not include an alpha. If you have a JPEG, for example, JPEGs don't carry alpha, where an EXR file can carry an alpha, or it might not carry an alpha. You know, and this is one of those really core things to how the merge works, because the alpha is applying math to the RGB in a way that Nuke uses for every merge operation. Speaking of merge operations, we dig into what those are. Nuke has a lot of merge operations. Really, there's just a handful that you're going to want to get into. And I go over what those are, as well as why you might use one over the other. You know, there's actually a fair amount of duplicate merge operations, but they have an inverse relationship in terms of the A input or the B input and how that math is applied. Lastly, in this section, we get into the format and bounding box. You know, this would equate to more of your traditional project settings, but Nuke doesn't necessarily respect the project settings if the input image is different. You know, project settings apply to generators and things that are created inside of Nuke, but if you're bringing in different sized input images, there are some differences here, and this is a really good thing to know about, you know, both from a performance standpoint and just understanding how everything works together. All right, next up we have script organization. For me, this is a huge one. You know, if you were to watch any of these videos, this is the one I would suggest everyone watch, regardless of your skill level. For me, you know, it comes down to working a specific way, and while you can work a bunch of different ways in Nuke, being organized, you know, and being organized in sort of specific ways can really help the process, both for yourself, or if you're working in a multi-artist workflow, and even from a, you know, pure hardware compute standpoint. Having a very well organized script will lead to efficiencies for your PC. It'll let you squeeze more out of your compute. You know, you can optimize your scripts to actually perform better with the kind of hardware that you have. One of the things I talk about is working explicitly, pre-multiplied over, and additively. And what that means is we're basically building modules. You know, we're building modules of an image where we're operating on a specific part of the image, and we're creating all of those into their own sort of standalone chunks. And by creating those chunks and then thinking about how we put those all back together, we can create some really efficient, really modular scripts. And this is really what I'm going over in this chapter. You know, it's how you want to start putting those nodes together in a way that both makes sense to you and might make sense to everyone else on your team. All right, next up we're going to talk about color space. Color space, and I'm not going to get deep into this. You know, color space is, we could do a whole 6-hour course on just color space. You know, I'm not going to touch on ACEs in this particular video. ACEs is the Academy color setup that's meant to sort of unify the color process across all the different trades. And we're not going to get there. We're just going to talk about Nuke's default color. A lot of shops still use that. You know, there has been a little bit stronger move into ACEs I've seen in some shops, but for the most part, we're going to talk about Nuke's default color setup. I'm going to really just go over some of the gotchas and give you a little heads up on how to look at color space and how to think about it, as well as kind of how to tell when something's wrong. Because really, when we're dealing with color space, especially in a production environment, a lot of times you'll open something and, you know, you need to be able to look at it and say, something feels wrong with this, you know, and flag that up to a supervisor or, you know, the pull house or wherever it came from, and maybe start a discourse on where something went wrong. Next up is tracking. And this is actually a fairly important course because this has a lot of performance ramifications, both from a compute standpoint, but also from a complexity standpoint and just how you comp your shots. Tracking is something we do a lot of in compositing. You know, rarely are we given track data. Occasionally we are. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. Sometimes we wind up having to retrack something anyway. You know, and what I really want to get across to everyone in this session is that the better our base tracks are, the less work we're going to have to do downstream. So creating really strong tracks from the beginning, it really gives us a much more stable base to composite on. And what you'll find with that is you'll actually get to spend more time doing creative work versus trying to fix something where maybe the track was a little off, but you just used it, and then by the time you get to the end of your script and you're starting to do some maybe finishing level things, you wind up having to counter animate or do work that's sort of in opposition to that track because that track had some issues to start with. You know, so we talk about how to stabilize your footage, how to visualize a track so that you can actually verify that that track is working or isn't working. You know, I give you some tips and tricks on that process and really, you know, trying to get you the best track you can and how to actually figure out if the track is good or not. Kind of in a similar vein to tracking, I do talk about roto. Again, people could write essays, you know, treatises on roto. I'm going to kind of go over the basics, and this is more of to like keep you from going down a really terrible labor-intensive rabbit hole. You know, we talk about breaking roto shapes up into individual pieces and how to approach it. Again, this also kind of ties into tracking because we talk about sort of, you know, walk cycles and keyframing cycles and how those keyframes, how to actually optimize your keyframe position so that you're doing as little work as physically possible, because roto is inherently labor intensive. But there are definitely some things we can do that make roto go a little bit faster and a little bit easier, you know, and again, in the same theme, roto can be modular. You know, it seems a little menial and kind of brutal sometimes, but there are ways to make roto a little bit more modular so that you can actually divide and conquer and split things up so different people can work on it, or you can work on it in different sections where you can work more efficiently on that individual piece or asset. Next up, we're going to talk about the paint tool. Just like roto, paint is one of those things that can be inherently labor intensive, and what we want to go over is how to think about the paint tool, you know, how to use it. I have some specific methodologies that I prefer using a paint tool, and those are mostly based in sort of usability and performance. You know, depending on how you use the paint tool, it can either be a fairly light and efficient tool that processes once and then you don't have to worry about it the rest of your frames, or it can be extremely intensive every single frame of your comp. You know, I show some of my methods for streamlining it a little bit, and you know, this chapter also kind of ties back to tracking because you're using those in concert with each other. You know, for me, I like to paint as a still frame. You know, I'm creating patches, so to speak, and then those patches are getting tracked back in. You know, so again, this is, you know, really informs your tracking, and if your tracking's working well, then your patches are going to work better, and you're going to have to do less work around the edges to make things live there. I also talk about some kind of, you know, pointers on how to actually do some painting. You know, it's not necessarily clear straight out of the box how you want to use this tool. Like there's little things like using the viewer gain and gamma controls to actually change how the image looks in your viewer to help you paint. You know, it helps you reveal gradients. It helps you reveal paint strokes that are maybe not working as well as they could be. You know, it also how to sort of create a light touch and create things that are organic. You know, the default tool settings don't necessarily create the most organic paint strokes. And so I go through some of the settings on the actual tools and how to approach them to create a little bit nicer finished product a little bit quicker. All right, next up we're going to talk about keying. And keying, you know, we're starting to maybe push a little bit out of the junior level work, but I want to plant a seed of, you know, where good keys come from and talk about what makes a good key versus what doesn't. A lot of people come into keying and think that, you know, the more crisp that your black and white output is from a keyer, the better, where really the really good keys, if you actually look at the alphas and you look at the result of those, you know, the guts of them are maybe a little dirty, they're maybe a little muddy, you know. And the idea with keying is less about creating this like ultra sharp matte to, you know, be able to really isolate every single pixel, and more about creating mattes that blend well with their background. Keying is a very contextual thing. It's not a black and white, you know, and that's something I try and show here. And, you know, the footage for this is actually awful. You know, it's got wrinkles, it's shot on an 8-bit camera. You know, it's really kind of a worst case scenario for having to pull a key. The only way it'd be worse is if I had mixed blue and green together, you know, laid across each other. But that's the design of this. You know, this isn't about a perfectly flat lit, smooth green screen with no imperfections and, you know, perfect shadows on the ground. This is meant to show that we have to deal with garbage, and there's an approach to that. And I want to show that, and I want to kind of show you some of the issues you're going to deal with. I don't want this sort of perfect, pristine thing where, you know, you slide the two knobs the way you're supposed to in the manual and it comes out looking perfect. You know, I want to show that process a little bit and how you build it. And again, this isn't a verbatim tutorial on keying. I just want to show how to approach it and how to think about keying so that it gives you better composites at the end of the day. So next up, let's talk about transforms. Transforms, they're very closely related to some of the things we talk about in tracking, but a tracker is actually generating the animation data. A transform is what's actually doing the work. And transforms can be used a lot of different ways. They can be used to animate objects, they can be used to shrink or scale or deform things. There are a lot of different ways to do things in Nuke, and these are just some of the gotchas I've found over the years and ways to think about transforms and ways to use transforms, things to be aware of when you're using them, you know, whether it's a filter method or, you know, some motion blur concerns. Like there are a lot of kind of minutia related to transforms and how you use them. And there's also a lot of different ways to transform things in Nuke. You know, we have 2D transforms, 3D transforms, we have vector-based transforms now, as well as, you know, UV-based. So I kind of talk about each of those and what they're good for, maybe what they're not so good for, just to give you kind of a toolbox. You know, I want you to kind of know what each does and where one might be appropriate versus the other. All right, and the last session we have in this series is finishing. I grew up as a 2D artist. I was a hardcore comp artist. Finishing is really a huge part of the game here. This is one of those that we could have another 6-hour course on just finishing if we really wanted to get into the guts of all of this. But what I'm trying to do here is show you how to approach finishing in a way that makes sense relative to the medium. Finishing is a very subjective thing, and the context of every shot requires maybe a different level of finishing. Sometimes we're creating templates and it's sort of a generic thing, or there are aspects of the finishing process that we know we could do, but maybe time or budget or creative aesthetic doesn't require of us. And other times there are shots that have to be finished, where we're replicating the dirt on the lens or the atmosphere, every sort of iota of minutia involved in creating an image. And, that's really what finishing is. It's taking something that's maybe a little glossy or a little raw, and it's what I call putting mud on the lens. We're making it greasy, we're making it muddy, we're sort of breaking it down a little bit. We're degrading it in a way that is similar to how the lens on the camera degrades it, or how the sensor on the camera degrades it, or even the atmosphere in the room. Everything sort of affecting the light, from the object we're shooting to the sensor, to the compression, to even how we're looking at it on a screen. And finishing is really just an offshoot of that. We're trying to replicate each of those phases of how light affects the image. That's what I talk about in this session. It's how to think about it. Where does light start? How are we capturing it? What kind of glass is it going through? What's the aperture of the camera? There's really a ton of different things that we can be sort of capturing and then reapplying through our compositing. And that's what finishing is all about. It's making it live there. All right, so that really breaks down, what each of these chapters are. I have been super excited to get this project done. It's been something that's been on my radar for quite a few years now. And then, I had a little shakeup last year and decided it was time to get this done. And the Foundry was kind enough to support me in that. And, I can't thank them enough for that, and hosting this and everything else. And I really hope that this is a beneficial course for anyone that's looking to expand their compositing knowledge. And if you want to learn a little bit about me, you can go to my website at austinwmeyers.com. You can see some of the stuff I've been up to. I've got my work on there. I've also got a contact form, so if you want to chat with me about a project or services or just shoot the breeze, I'd be happy to chat. Thanks again.
Awesome. That was really cool to see, Austin, and I think that course looks and sounds, I've actually already watched it, so I know it's already a really good one. But to me, it feels that gap that we often find where you get students or new users coming to Nuke, and they know how to put an image over the top of another image, but they don't know how to create a script that they can easily hand off in a comp department. And I think it tackles a lot of those issues.
And that was something I saw a lot, as a comp soup, where I would get people that would come in and they would kind of have a micro sense of a particular tool set or a workflow, like they could use Primat, but they didn't know how to hook Primat up to the rest of their script, or how it flowed with all the other things that you're going to have to ultimately do in a composite.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've got a few questions, so I'm going to jump over to those and we'll quickly answer some of them. And I've also got some that I'd be interested to know based on some of the cool things seen. So we have here, let's see, so way to push it. No, we have Ian asking if these videos will be available somewhere online. Yes, they'll be available on the Learn Foundry page. That's learn.foundry.com. I believe it'll be shared in the chat, the links. We have William Conway asking if everything in the course will be usable with the non-commercial version of Nuke. I'm glad you took a stab at this one, Austin. And yes, it will be. You will be able to use pretty much everything in there because it's non-commercial. It's just like regular Nuke It's just you're limited on a few things, but none of the things that will stop you from taking advantage of Austin's courses. Now we have one from Mateus, which will be good to get your thoughts on. Actually, Austin, do you know Python?
I know some Python. So like I mentioned before, I actually got into web development a long time ago, and I actually spent a year or two probably making more money building crappy websites than doing crappy video projects. And so I actually learned PHP and MySQL along with HTML and CSS back when I was fresh out of college. And when I got into compositing, I started to learn TCL because that's kind of what you use. That's a little bit more of your everyday script. You're using that to link tools together and do some string operations and stuff like that. And then as I became a comp soup, I started to get more into Python because there were things that I knew I could automate. I just needed somebody to do it. I never had some of the shops I was at, we didn't have any dedicated programmers where I could give them a problem to solve and then get a solution back. So I actually very poorly know Python is really the short answer of it. I know enough to be really dangerous and break things really badly. But I've used it over the years for things like building contact sheet viewers or taking files and then actually creating folder structure from those files using little Python snippets inside of Nuke. I use Nuke as the environment.
Yeah, I mean, you actually answered the second part of that question, which was, can you recommend areas where writing scripts in Nuke could improve a freelancer's workflow? And yeah, even if it's on the back end side of helping you to automate your data management, or you see a lot of people in Nukepedia building gizmos, and I think a lot of those are basically compositing artists who have dipped their toes in and figured out they could create a solution to problems they were having with many scripts.
Yeah, and there's definitely.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I really enjoyed your description of just knowing a little bit, because I feel like that's a lot of comp artists. We all know a little bit of Python, but not really a great deal, but enough to get the job done.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. If you like scripting, if programming is something that you kind of gravitate towards, I would definitely check it out, and I would look at the developer documentation. Nuke is basically just a Python program with a wrapper around it. So anything that you can do with the GUI, you can also script. And, a lot of the things, as you get into compositing, you'll realize we do a lot of the same things over and over and over again. And there are definitely some ways that you can start to script that stuff out. And that's what you start to see, with the gizmos and with some of the work being done on Nukepedia. And then when you go in maybe to a bigger shop, you see a lot of that sort of automation under the hood where people are using programming to help strip away some of those things that we do over and over and over again.
Definitely. In terms of examples, Mateus, I actually had one last year where for SIGGRAPH we had to create a giant background banner for one of the talks, and we just needed a loopable background with floating objects in it. And using Python enabled us to make that loop much easier than it would be to hand animate it and everything like that. So for me, that was a useful time where actually knowing Python was simplified my workflow. Okay, we've got a question from Francois Robert, and I'll push this one live actually. Do you think we could be working at home in the future, predominantly for compositing?
I hope so, because I moved to Montana. So I put my money on that horse. No, I think, and I talked to a lot of my buddies and other supervisors about this. I think there's a strong chance that even when things go back to normal, I think there's going to be, we've opened that door. The cat's out of the bag on that, and I think a lot of people have realized that there are definitely some benefits to working at home. Historically, with visual effects in particular, infrastructure is an issue with working at home because not everybody has a beast machine or render capability or licenses. But I just did a job for the last 2.5, 3 months via Teradici where I remoted into the shop, from whatever machine I wanted. So I actually spent 3 weeks of that on the road. We bought an RV and we were kind of RVing cross country to visit family. And so we would drive some, and then I would spend the rest of the day working on my laptop, remoted into the same machine that I was remoted into when I was at my home office. So yeah, I think it's definitely moving that direction. I'm curious to see how much it sticks, because I mean, a lot of places went full remote where every single artist is remote. I also know of other shops that have physically closed their brick and mortar. You know, they don't plan on having a physical location anymore. They're going to have a server rack in a closet somewhere, and they're going to have sort of a distributed workforce. I mean, I think it's definitely the future. And it, you know, for me as a comp soup, it's a really nice thing because now I can leverage talent anywhere, you know, as long as they're in a time zone that kind of works out. And even if they're not, you know, this last gig I was on, we were able to work whatever hours we wanted. So there were a lot. I have 2 little kids. I have one 4-year-old and one 2-year-old. And so they're a little bit of a handful scheduling wise. And it was really nice because I could wake up at 6 a.m, work for a couple hours, and then kind of make breakfast and help them out, get everybody out the door, work for a few more, and then there's lunch and nap time, and then bedtime and bath, and then work till midnight or 2 a.m. if I wanted to.
Yeah. How do you think, as we move to more working remotely, and with new artists, it's always been tricky breaking into the industry because there's a lot of people wanting to do this. But once you're in, obviously, it's a tight-knit community. It's very much everyone knows everyone. But it seems like it's a different space trying to join an industry which is so separated. And like how, for example, you mentioned when you were joining, you would have that artist to your right who you learn from. How do you think, or what do you think new artists joining a company for the first time that's working remotely should do to help themselves progress and learn?
So ask questions. That's, one of the things I see. I've seen a lot of kids come straight out of school or not go to school and just start. One of my good friends and a super talented guy, he's never been to any kind of school ever. He was homeschooled, maybe, kind of. And then he, wound up getting a job at 18. We worked together in Louisiana, and he's a comp soup now of really top tier class. And there was no traditional school ever for him there. I think getting into the business is going to be a little more interesting. In some ways it might be better because if you can work remote, you don't have to move to whatever, ratty town where the tax incentives are the highest and that's where the shop opened because it's the most bottom line friendly. I think, there's the opportunity to maybe have a little better actually work-life balance with some of that, because you don't have to necessarily go to LA or New York or a tax incentive state. Some of the advice I've given for years is go to where the work is. Don't go to LA or New York and then be a waiter while you're trying to become a runner at one of the bigger shops. Go to New Mexico, go to Louisiana, go to Georgia, go to, Montreal or Quebec, wherever, those places are usually hungry for people. And that's how I started. I had no experience in actual compositing. I did have some post experience and I had a degree in film. And so the owner of that shop, he hired me and paid me more than I was making in Austin. And I wanted to be in Austin, but I was just, I was killing myself to make ends meet. And that move to Louisiana kind of opened all the doors for me. And it was taking that jump. But I also got, probably a 5-year jump on the industry that way, because I was able to go there, get hired directly as a compositor. I didn't have to jump through hoops and be a runner, or be an intern, or do any of that stuff. I was getting paid from day one to basically learn the software. And, it turns out I was pretty good at it. And so I wound up working my way up, and I was able to boost my titles. And then I was able to take that title and move it to the coasts. And that's something I really want to emphasize to people. It's like they were hungry for people. So you always, if you can, get paid to learn and go to where you're wanted.
Yeah, no, I think that makes complete sense. It's like you were running your studio and a new composer, joined, what would be something that would impress you or would help them stand out?
Say that one more time. You broke up a little bit.
Oh, of course. if a new junior compa was joining your studio, and what could they do to help impress or stand out? Like, it's obviously a different environment working remotely. So how do you build, relationships? Because that's a key part of the industry as well, not just learning how to use the tools, but how to get on with your team.
Yeah, and that's a little trickier thing. I mean, historically, especially for new artists, I'm looking at them a little more holistically. Like, I see a lot of people ask too, like, should I get a degree in this, or should I get a traditional 4-year in something else? So I'm looking at what they did in those places. Like, every once in a while, I'll see somebody that wants to get into the business and they have a computer science degree, and to me, that's super exciting because I'm a terrible coder. And again, like, I know enough to be dangerous. So if I can actually then leverage that person to fill in my knowledge gaps, that becomes they become a very tantalizing hire for me. And then I can, we can kind of trade knowledge is one of those things I like to do, where it's like, okay, you can help me with this. I'm going to teach you how to composite and be an artist and work on a team. But yeah, it's one of those. It's kind of hard with the socialization aspect of it. I think being vocal in forums, being vocal with support. I mean, I got connected with the Foundry because I was pinging their support line all the time. So they just got to know me and they got to know the projects I was working on. I came in to the fold with the Foundry years ago when stereo became a thing, and I was working on an actual live action shot in stereo movie. And there was a lot of like, how do you do this? Like, nobody knew because it hadn't really been done before. And, I lit those poor support guys up basically every day. And so then when they wanted to do a demo on stereo, they called me and said, hey, you did a stereo thing. What did you learn? And then they asked me like 2 days before the presentation to release some new product. They'd just finished early. So I was like, oh, but no, it's, yeah, it's kind of hard. It's being out there. The other thing, honestly, like, if you tell me in the interview, you put on your resume that you've read the whole manual, that's going to go a long way into making me look at you, because a lot of the things I see is people don't they don't know the tools they have at their fingertips. And I say this in the course too, like, read the manual. It sucks, but read it, because you don't know what you don't know. And by reading the manual, you might not fully grasp what all of that is, but you then know where it is, hit that level where that might become a relevant topic. The camera tracking stuff or whatever. It might be, like, this doesn't make any sense to me now, but after you spend 3 months in Nuke and you've read other parts of the manual, all of a sudden it's going to click and you're going to be like, oh, I know a way to solve this problem. I don't remember exactly how, but you know where that lives in the manual and you can go read up on it. And that's really how I learned. I have read the manual years ago, probably should reread it. But I just, I'd open Nuke and I would get stomped. I'd flip the manual open and I would scroll until I found it. And then I'd wind up scrolling a little more and reading about 3 or 4 other things while I was in there. And I basically just spidered through the whole manual over, a couple of months. And that was honestly one of the most helpful things for me professionally, because we're meant to solve problems. That's what compositors are really doing most of the time, is we have a specific set of problems. Sometimes they're more esoteric than others. Sometimes they're pretty much brute force. But by knowing what exactly you have in the software and what tools are really at your fingertips goes a long way to, being a very complete artist.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's something definitely from my seniors when I was a much junior artist. We've actually got a few more questions to cover. So Francois Robert also asks, do you prefer spline or B-spline for roto?
I'm in the Bezier camp. I don't think B-splines are very much fun or that nice.
What don't you like about them? Or what do you find they cause? Why do you choose one over the other?
They're what you see, what you get. Like, when you click the point, the line is there. When you lay your B-splines down, the line moves on you. So you wind up having to draw the shape and then go back and noodle the shape. Where with a Bezier, I can just smash it out right there and I'm done with it. I don't have to go back and like reassemble it because everything slipped once I added extra points to it.
I definitely feel like, well, there's always ways to approach problems in Nuke. Sometimes you've got to lean on the thing that you find will get the job done for you. And it's important learning what aspects of your workflows are for you and what's for someone else to approach. Cool, we've got another question. So in addition to Nuke, which programs do you consider the most useful to know?
I mean, I think it's good to know. So in addition to Nuke, I'm pretty strong in Resolve from both an editorial standpoint and a color delivery standpoint. And then I unfortunately have like a solid 10 years of Blender under my belt as well. And yeah, I love Blender. It's awesome. But I started learning Blender because I needed simulations to augment my comp in a way that elements weren't getting the job done. But I do think it is good to sort of at least have a cursory understanding of what the other departments are doing in terms of like the total pipeline, because then you start to understand their pain. By knowing Resolve, and a lot of this ties back. Like I was the director of post at Deutsch, and so I was helping put together all the pieces from dailies and ingest to offline edit to online edit to video, visual effects, motion graphics, and then ship and delivery. And knowing those things, you can start to sort of cut problems off before you get there. It's if the color space is wrong, if something's not coming in correctly or handles are weird, by kind of having an understanding of those programs on the periphery of what you're doing, it'll just help you make more informed decisions or nip something in the bud before it becomes a much bigger problem.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with the idea of having experience in the wider part of the workflow allows you to problem solve a lot better on your side. And I imagine, obviously, with how your career has progressed, that delving into those other areas opened opportunities for you to be able to do things like help build a pipeline.
Yeah, and I have that curse where I'm sort of addicted to learning. Like I sit down and next thing you know, it's 4 a.m. and I have to wake up in 3 hours because I went down a rabbit hole on how to match black levels and Resolve or work on curves or what. It's a sickness.
I noticed on your website that you've been doing some Arduino tinkering, and that's something I'm doing in my downtime as well. So I was like,
yeah, and I play with Raspberry Pis. I have a stack of Arduinos on my desk. I got a 3D printer sitting right next to me. I took this past year off. I went and worked for a countertop fabrication outfit as the plant manager, and I went in and helped them basically rewire their pipeline. I worked on their 5-axis CNC machines. I was their backup, saw guy and backup mill guy. I like tinkering and I like building pipelines. That's kind of one of those things that has always been interesting to me. And Nuke, at its core, is a mini pipeline. A node graph is a pipeline, and so that was one of those things. It at a super micro level, it's the same thing as at a studio level.
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting to imagine what you could have applied from a VFX pipeline into that kind of role.
The crossover was huge. There was a lot that I knew that even the guys that have been running the machines for years and years didn't know, but it's, I've kind of touched that stuff between being on set and working with motion control rigs and everything else. It's all kind of the same stuff when you boil it down.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to throw some quick fire questions at you because we're a minute to 9. So is there a reason there's no chapter devoted to 3D in Nuke in this one?
It kind of 3D is one of those things, and there is a little bit. It's buried inside tracking, because 3D in Nuke is, well, I guess the question is, are we talking about dealing with 3D renders, or are we talking about the actual 3D workspace?
I'd imagine the 3D workspace.
So yeah, the 3D workspace, I do discuss it relative to tracking, and for me, it's once you learn the tools, it kind of applies. All the same rules apply that apply to everything else. So it's not like you're working much differently. You do have that extra loop of a scanline render, and then you are obviously working in a 3D 3D workspace. But yeah, it's really, you know, once you get into that tracking session and you watch kind of how all the things come together, and I actually do I think one of those sessions is a actual demo of doing a camera track, project, and reproject workflow to do some like paint fixes on some stuff. And that'll give you a sense of kind of how that 3D system's working inside of Nuke and, you know, the way to approach it. Because you're really approaching it the same way. It's just you have 2D modules where you have lots of different nodes stacked together. And then you have 3D modules, and ultimately they have to become 2D. So in effect, they're 2D and they operate the same way as every other 2D module inside your script.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, unfortunately, that's time now. So I just want to extend a massive thank you first to Austin. It's been really nice getting to hear from yourself an overview of the course. I actually think it was really valuable to see where you found value and interest in what you were trying to convey. And I think diving into the course will be really valuable for a lot of people. And I just want to thank everyone in the chat, everyone who's joined and been a part of this session, because it's, you know, we can't do this stuff without you, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Oh, no, I really appreciate, you know, the Foundry helped me a ton in getting this course put on. So it really, you know, it's been something I've wanted to do for a while, and it's been nice to have the support from the Foundry and get this thing done, and hopefully everybody will, you know, benefit from this.
Yeah, I definitely think I will. So apologies to those questions at the end that we didn't get a chance to answer. If you want to post them, we'll try and answer them afterwards, or you can post them on the community channels, and I'm sure you'll get a bunch of answers there. And yeah, everyone, thank you so much once again, and please do stay safe. We look forward to seeing you in a future webinar or hopefully in person. Cheers.